Have you ever stopped to think about how a modern government is actually built? Not in one go, but piece by piece over literally centuries. Well, today we're diving into the incredible story of how a private company's rule over an entire subcontinent was slowly, and sometimes violently, transformed into the legal blueprint for two of the world's biggest nations. So let's trace that remarkable journey.
The questions here are just staggering when you think about them. How on earth does a for-profit trading company end up running a subcontinent? And then, how does that corporate rule finally get taken apart and replaced? The answer is, well, they're not in some single Big Bang revolution. Instead, they're found in this slow, deliberate series of laws that spanned almost 200 years.
All right, so our story doesn't start with independence. It actually starts with control. You see, by the late 1700s, the East India Company was ridiculously powerful, but it was also kind of on the brink of going bankrupt, thanks to all the corruption and the crazy costs of its wars. The British government back in London knew it had to get a handle on this out-of-control corporate arm in India. Basically, it was time to put the company on a leash.
And that leash just got tighter and tighter over time. So in 1773, you have the Regulating Act, which was Parliament's very first real intervention. Then by 1784, they'd set up this funky two bosses system. Come 1833, power gets seriously centralized, and by 1853 we start to see the first little hints of a modern government, with legislative and executive powers being separated. Each one of these acts was a calculated move, pulling power away from the company and into the hands of the state.
So this two bosses system, which came from Pitt's India Act, was actually a pretty clever way to divide power. You had the Board of Control, that's the government, taking over all the important stuff. Politics, military, you name it. And the company's court of directors, well, they were left to manage what they were supposed to be doing all along, business and commerce. So the bottom line? The company could still make its money, but the crown was now calling all the political shots.
Then the Charter Act of 1833 took things a massive step further. It basically stripped the company of its trading business entirely. And just like that, the transformation was complete. It went from being a trading company that also happened to govern to being a purely administrative body that was just governing for the crown. And this total centralization of power, it was all wrapped up in one big title change.
Yeah, changing the title from Governor General of Bengal to Governor General of India was way more than just changing some words on a business card. It meant that one person, the first guy was Lord William Bentinck, now held all civil and military power over all of British India. The other big presidencies, like Bombay and Madras, they lost their power to make laws. Centralization was now total.
But this whole setup, a company ruling for a government, was about to hit a brick wall, and hard. This brings us to the second act of our story, the crown finally stepping in and taking direct, total control. The leash was about to be cut for good, and the middleman was about to get fired.
And what lit the fuse? The massive uprising known as the Revolt of 1857. This rebellion was so widespread, it just shook the foundations of British rule to its core. It totally convinced London that the East India Company was just not fit to govern anymore. The whole system of indirect rule had failed, and they needed a new plan, fast.
The result was the Government of India Act of 1858, which was a complete system overhaul. The East India Company, gone. That double government thing replaced by a single Secretary of State for India. And the title Governor General, it became Viceroy, making it crystal clear that this person was the direct representative of the Queen. The middleman was officially out of a job.
Now, just 3 years after the crown took over, something quiet but absolutely monumental happened. For the very first time, in 1861, 3 Indians were nominated to the Legislative Council. It was the first, very small, but incredibly important step on a very, very long road.
And that first nomination of Indians to the council, it was the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. That really kicks off our final phase. As Indian nationalism started to grow, the British government kept responding with new laws that slowly, and let's be honest, often reluctantly, expanded Indian representation. This was the long, winding path towards self-rule.
Now, a really key and deeply controversial idea that came out of the 1909 reforms was the separate electorates. So what is it? It's a system where voting was split along religious lines. Only members of a certain community could vote for candidates from that same community. Now, the idea was supposedly to protect minority interests, but what it really did was formalize religious division in politics. And the guy behind it, Lord Minto, even earned the nickname Father of the Communal Electorate.
Okay,
Let's fast forward another 10 years to 1919, and we get yet another new system called diarchy. It sounds complicated, but it basically just split provincial governments in two. You had the reserved subjects, like the police and finance. The British governor kept direct control of those. But then you had transferred subjects, like education and health, which were handled by Indian ministers. So it was a partial, kind of hesitant transfer of power.
But the most important piece of law before independence was, without a doubt, the Government of India Act of 1935. This thing was a beast. It proposed a federation for all of India, it divided powers into federal and provincial lists, a structure that's actually still a core part of India's constitution today, and it finally gave real autonomy to the provinces. In so many ways, this was the blueprint for India's future government. And that brings us to the end of this 200-year legal journey. World War II had left Britain exhausted, and the call for independence in India was just unstoppable. So the very last piece of British law, driven by the Mountbatten Plan, wasn't going to be about governing India anymore. It was about ending the empire. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 was the final chapter. It officially declared India independent, but, at the same time, partitioned the subcontinent into two new countries, India and Pakistan. The act got rid of the viceroy, it ended British power over the princely states, and most critically, it handed over all lawmaking power to the new constituent assemblies of the two nations. The nearly 200-year transfer of power was at last complete.
So when you look back at this whole incredible 200-year story, from that very first regulating act all the way to the final Independence Act, you're left with this really big question. Were all these laws the essential foundation that built the institutions for a free, democratic India? Or did they end up creating a framework of division that left behind a really painful and lasting legacy? The answer, well, like history itself, is probably a bit of both.